Okay, so today I want to talk about brass case longevity. One area of firearms that I'm really into, that's just thoroughly interesting to me, is black powder cartridge rifles. Now, around about the 1860s, 70s, 80s, here we have an example from 1887, firearm technology started making a turn towards cartridge rifles, as opposed to muzzle loaders, paper cartridges, pinfire cartridges, that sort of thing. In this sort of era, we start seeing what we now know as the modern cartridge. Now, this particular example is a Martini-Henry Mark IV, number 1. Number 4 Mark 1? No, it's a Martini-Henry Mark IV. And this rifle fires a cartridge called the 5.77-450. It's a big old case. Parent case for this is the 5.77, which came out of the Snider rifles. It's a 57 caliber, and when the British decided that they wanted to update their rifles, they went to a 45 caliber. So they took the 57 caliber, necked down to 45, and we here have the 5.77-450. Now, the original load was a whole bunch of black powder, somewhere in the region of 80 to 82 grains of old school black powder, behind a projectile that was really fucking heavy. Okay, so the original cartridge was made out of foil with a steel base. It's like a brass foil with a steel base. Carried about 80 to 82 grains of powder, depending on the source that you read. And the bullet weight was 480 grains. We got a velocity of around about 1,350 feet per second with the original loading. That gives you 1,944 pounds of energy. It hurts on both ends of the rifle. The cartridge is labeled as a 45 caliber cartridge, but after slugging the ball, this one mics at .469, so it's roughly 47 caliber. However, it did receive the designation of 45. Now, this particular rifle is not 100% original. I've got some experimental sights that I've made, and the forend here is not original. This particular forend I carved myself out of desert ironwood, and it looks fantastic. Wonderful burl patterns, nice grain patterns in here. I picked ironwood because it's very dense, it's very heavy, and it helped tame the recoil, and it helps with the longevity of the rifle. Now, I changed the contour of this particular section between the receiver and the first barrel band, and then the contour after the first barrel band up to the second is same as original. I just wanted this end to be a little bit fatter for, I guess, bench resting purposes, and also because I have really big fucking hands. I'm going to try and find a piece of ironwood that I can use to replace the rear stock for this particular rifle, but that's a project for a later date. But talking about brass cases, these have been fired before. I'm not sure how many times. I didn't write it down like an idiot. There's a bunch of black powder fouling on the inside, even though these have been through a case cleaner, through a tumbler. The outside of the case is looking immaculate, but the inside of the case will always carry some sort of residue because it's black powder. And because I don't know how many times this thing has been fired since I last annealed them, I'm going to go ahead and anneal them again. Now, annealing just makes the brass soft again, because brass, as we know, work hardens. So as the brass flexes or obturates through the firing process, the shoulder, the neck, and the body of the case will all expand inside of the chamber to create the gas seal to push the bullet down the barrel. The more often you do that, the harder and the more brittle the brass is going to get. So periodically we do need to anneal these to make them soft again, so that they can expand and contract the way they're supposed to. Now, the annealing process is going to involve heating up the shoulder and the neck section to the point where it starts to glow a little bit, where it's getting slightly incandescent, just hot enough. And then for brass, for the annealing process, it is safe to then dunk it in some water. That is not going to temper the brass like it would steel, because brass is not steel, it is not iron. So heating it up and dropping it in water isn't going to make it hard and brittle. It's going to make it soft again. To heat these things up, I'm going to use a little propane torch. Something you can pick up at your local hardware store. Get it at the local getting spot. I'm also going to use a little hand drill with a piece of wire stuck out the end of the chuck. And I'm going to place the case on the wire and turn it slowly while it's in the flame. Then just a bucket with some water in the bottom. Drop them in and you're done. That'll be the next phase of the project. Okay, so here we have the basic setup. We got our propane torch. Got a bucket full of water, got a little hand drill, a piece of wire in it. We put a couple bends in this so that it actually grabs onto the shell, or onto the case, and it'll actually spin it. I've moved outside because since we're combusting things, we want to be in a well-ventilated area, and there's nothing more well-ventilated than outside. Basics of the setup: take our drill, take our case on the end of the wire, spin that while we put it into the flame and heat the case up. We want to pretty much anneal just the shoulder area and the neck area, because those are the areas of the case that are going to be worked the most. I'm not too concerned with the body of the case because this is black powder and it's not extremely high pressure, but residual heat from the shoulder and the neck will creep into the body of the case and will have some sort of annealing effect. First step, turn on the torch. Get a nice flame going, doesn't have to be ridiculously hot. And you'll see the change in color in the case as it gets hot. Once you see it get to a pinkish color, pinky gold, you drop it into the water and that's it. We do this as many times as we have cases. And I have 2 batches of 20 to do. And that's pretty much it. I'm going to keep on doing this and I'll catch up with you when I'm done. Okay, coming back from outside, we've done all the heating to the brass that we need to do. I've got my collection of cases here. You can see that, well, maybe not, but they are all currently wet. All currently wet from being in the bucket. The brass has been discolored here. Now this dark stuff on the neck, that's likely buildup from either the propane or whatever stuff was in the bucket at the time. This will come off when we put the cases in the case cleaner. The polishing media will take care of that. But you'll see that all this brass up to here has been annealed. This end more so than this end, which is okay. You'll see there's a pretty distinct line on the case, around about there. And that's the area of the case that we want to anneal, because this is going to be the area that is most worked when the case is fired. And compare that to another case from a different batch that has not been annealed. Now this up here, I know that this is carbon buildup. This is black powder. This is what happens when we fire black powder out of cases. But here we can see that the cases are now annealed. New cases as they come from the factory, this is for 7.5 Swiss, you'll see that they have the same annealing mark. And this one has been polished a little bit. Their line is right there by my thumb. From the case mouth to a little bit beyond the shoulder, that's all been annealed. That's nice and soft. It's a slight difference in scale, but same sort of effect. Next step in the process, what I want to do is I want to punch these primers out so I can get some cleaning media into the primer pockets. Once I have the primers popped out, I want to make sure that the cases are dry. I'm going to drop them into the case tumbler for about an hour. Okay, so what we're going to do is going to take our cases. We're going to find some sort of something that we can put them on that has space in it for the spent primer to go into. Going to stand the case on that. Use some sort of tool to push the case out. Drop that through the flash hole. Tap it with a hammer. There's your spent primer. And there's your primer pocket. You'll see that it's full of carbon. This is pretty typical of black powder cartridges. Not only is it full of carbon, it is also now wet. We want to get as much of that out as we can with the cleaning media in the tumbler. So I'm going to do that same thing 40 different times now. Okay, so I've put these in the tumbler. I've had myself some lunch while these were sitting and polishing, and they've come out pretty nice. Some of them polished up a little better than others. This one in particular, we've managed to polish carbon deposits on the outside. The chambers on these Martini-Henrys are very generously cut, so these little aberrations, not a big deal. As you can see, they do still chamber. They will function just fine. Next thing I want to do is I want to use a brush to make sure that the polishing media is cleaned out from the inside of these cases. It's going to take up case volume that we want to reserve for black powder. There's a little brush on the inside, pretty much all we need. And make sure that the primer pockets are clear of polishing media as well. And then we are going to separate these by lots. And I've differentiated them by making little cuts with a very tiny file on the case rim. So I'm just going to brush the inside of the cases real quick. And then when we're done with that, we're going to clean our primer pockets. Okay, so here we have our 2 lots of brass, and in the middle here is all the crap that came out of them after tumbling. Next step now is going to be to clean out the primer pockets, and to do that we're going to use the primer pocket cleaning tool. You'll see that it's got 2 ends here, one large, one small. It's a very simple tool, looks kind of like a screwdriver, and this is going to remove carbon fouling from the inside of the primer pocket. It's a very simple process. Just put it in there, spin it around a couple of times, and it's going to pull out will scrape off a lot of the crap that's inside there. Now this primer pocket doesn't have to be immaculately clean. Clean enough is good enough in this case. The reason that we clean these primer pockets out though is so that the primer can seat adequately to a proper depth so that it will become functional. And we're just going to sit and do this 40 times in a row. Okay, so what we've done is we've annealed the cases, tumbled them to make them clean, and we've cleaned out the primer pockets. You will notice that some of these cases are out of round at the case mouth. That's okay. The annealing process has made that brass soft, and through handling, through tumbling, transport between the different areas, this is the kind of thing that happens. It's not a big deal. That's going to be taken care of in the next step, which is going to be sizing the brass. Now, because I'm only putting this through one rifle, I'm only going to be sizing the neck area of the case. That means I'm just going to crimp it down so that it's of the appropriate size to accept the bullet, and it's got a nice firm hold on that bullet. I'm not going to resize the rest of the case, the body of the case or the shoulder, because that has now been fire formed to the dimensions of the chamber. So it's a nice tight fit inside of the chamber around the body of the case and the shoulder, and then the neck of the case is the part that's going to be a nice tight fit around the bullet. I do this mostly for the longevity of the brass cases because I want them to last as long as possible. An added benefit of sizing the neck only, going to be more consistent tension on the bullet, and it's going to be more consistently concentric with the center line of the case. So that's going to make it a little bit more accurate. Okay, so this big red thing in front of you here, this is called a single stage reloading press because it has only one position on the ram. For the sizing operation, I use what's called collet die. Inside here, there's a collet and a mandrel. And as you push the case into the die, the ram will push in the bottom of the die here, which then pushes up on the collet, and the collet squeezes down onto the brass, forming it to the diameter of the mandrel. Setting one of these up in the press is pretty easy. You raise the ram on the press, screw down the die until you make contact with the shoal holder, give it a little bit of an extra turn beyond that. So that way, at full extension of the ram, you're actuating the collet on the inside. This stage, we put the brass into the shoal holder, push it up into the collet. We do this very slowly and gently because the brass is very soft. All the way down, and we give it a little extra push, and that squeezes the brass around the mandrel. I'm not sure if you can pick this up on the camera. Because there are gaps in the collet, there are little ridges left on the brass. So what I like to do, make sure we have a good consistent squeeze around the entire circumference, squeeze it down, give it a 45-degree turn more or less, squeeze it again, and that makes sure that this is nice and uniformly round. Okay, now that the brass is sized, the next operation in the reloading step is going to be seating primers into the cases, and we're going to do that with a primer seating tool. This fits into the ram like so, underneath the case holder, so that when you push down, you'll see that it protrudes. This here's a little cup, which centers the primer. It's spring loaded. And the pin in the middle of that is going to push the primer into the primer pocket. You may be able to see off to the right side of the ram here, that little cup is exposed when the ram comes up. Going to take a single primer. In this case, it's a Winchester large rifle primer for standard rifle loads. Going to put primer in that little cup. Make sure we take the die out, because if we go too far, the die is just going to push the primer back out. Primer's loaded into the primer tool. Going to do now is push forward on the handle, bringing the case down over top of the primer. I'm going to give it a good solid push until it stops moving and install that primer. You want it to be slightly below flush in relation to the head of the case. You'll be able to feel that with your finger. And again, we repeat this process for however many cases we have. Okay, so now that all the cases are primed, we're ready to start putting some powder into them. Now, a lot of people are going to say that black powder needs to be measured volumetrically. And I say to them that this isn't baking. When you're baking and the recipe calls for 1 cup of flour, most often people are going to use a volumetric measure of that flour, as 1 cup is a volumetric unit of measurement. However, a grain, when it relates to firearms and reloading, is a unit of weight. So I measure out my powder charges by weight. I like to use this analog scale because I feel that it is more accurate and more repeatable than an electric scale. So here I'm just zeroing it out, calibrating it, so that the scale reads 0 grains when there's nothing in the little pan here. I want to make sure that that repeats, and we're good. So the powder charge that I'm going to use for this particular batch is 78 grains. I've done my research into what is an acceptable powder charge for a Martini-Henry, and I've made batches of ammunition all the way from 76 grains up to 82 grains. they've all fired just fine out of the rifle. Here I'm calibrating it to read 0 at 78 grains. Powder that I'm using today is Swiss 2F black powder. Now the 2F is just the designation of the size of the grains of the powder. The higher the number of Fs, the smaller the grains are going to be. 1F powder is going to be fairly coarse. 2F powder is going to be very slightly less coarse. Please do not use my load data as a good idea to start your load data or as a starting point for your load data. Do your own research and figure it out for yourself. I don't necessarily know what I'm doing, but this has worked for me in the past. Might not be so good for you though. Okay, so as you can see, we've poured too much powder. And 78 grains is a lot, and pouring it by hand, getting it exactly at 78 is kind of difficult. I'm going to use my plastic spoon here, take some out of the pan, and I'm very careful about adding just a few grains at a time. Trickle the powder back into the pan until we get this line to read 0. Carefully every single time. That there reads 0. I'm going to store whatever excess from the pour in this little pan down here. We've weighed out 78 grains of powder. I'm going to take my powder funnel, put it over the top of the case, and slowly I'm going to pour the powder against the side of the funnel so that it falls down into the case. Now there are people out there, some black powder cartridge gurus, who say that you should use what's called a drop tube. It's just a really long brass tube that you will drop the powder down. The logic behind this is that it settles the grains of powder inside of the case more uniformly. I theorize that pouring the grains of powder against the side of the funnel has the same sort of effect, and that's putting powder into the cases. You've got to make sure that your charge is exactly the same every time and that your charge is within the safety limits of the cartridge. Now, this being an old obsolete cartridge from more than 130 years ago, there isn't exactly a SAMI spec on this. So do your research, figure it out, and you'll be okay. Okay, so we've weighed out all the powder charges for each case. Next thing to do is do a visual inspection inside of every case to make sure that they all have relatively the same level of powder. We know that each powder charge inside of the case weighs the same because we painstakingly weighed every single one. We're just doing a visual inspection to see that each of them is full roundabout at the same level. Now with modern cartridges using nitrocellulose powder, the next phase would be just to put a bullet in, to crimp it, and to take it to the range and shoot it. But because this is a black powder cartridge, there are a few other steps involved. Now this isn't a maximum charge. I believe these cases will hold about 90 grains of powder before they're considered full, while still giving space for the bullet in the neck. So there's a lot of case volume inside of here. Now we've only put 78 grains in, so the powder charge is only coming up to about that high on these cases. So that means there's a bit of open space between the top of the powder charge and what will be the base of the bullet. Now for modern cartridges using nitrocellulose powder, that's not necessarily an issue because the powder is formulated in such a way that you get a nice controlled burn of the powder column when it's ignited. That controlled burn produces a nice smooth pressure curve. Black powder, on the other hand, burns at a much faster rate than the nitrocellulose powder. And that gap could result in an effect that's more akin to a pipe bomb than it is to a controlled burn. That's not necessarily a good thing. So what we got to do is we got to fill up that empty space. Now in a straight-walled cartridge, like a 4570, best practice to fill up that gap, best filler to use would be a granular filler. I believe people use cornmeal. It's a nice, very fine powder, and you use that to fill the gap between the powder charge and the bullet. That works great in a straight-wall cartridge like a 4570. But the 577-450 being a neck cartridge, a granular filler isn't necessarily the best option. So I use carded wool. This is the same wool that you get when you peel your sheep, except this is slightly processed. It's cleaned, it's refined, it's washed, and this is just the straight wool. This is basically the same as your hair. Now, when I first started reloading for the 577-450, I used a section of cotton to fill that gap. And when I took the rifle to the range and I fired a few shots downrange in the dry season, I learned the hard way that cotton will carry an ember into very dry grass, and almost burnt the range down. Thankfully, though, I could call a ceasefire, and the range officers were very understanding that I was shooting black powder and that I should basically stop shooting that particular load. So I finished what I had, made sure that there weren't any embers traveling further downrange, and from that point on I switched to wool. Wool, on the other hand, does not carry an ember. So now to fill this gap, all I do is I take a section or a tuft with this wool. I'm not super precise about how much this tuft weighs or exactly how many fibers there are per tuft. I just take a bunch of it, and using an old 545 case of Russian design, I tamp it down over the powder charge. Now I'm not too concerned about tamping down the powder charge. Figures that I've heard is that a black powder charge can be compressed up to 15%. Not sure how you arrive at that figure, but in all muzzle loaders, you tamp down the powder charge anyway. And those function just fine. And this wool has a lot of give to it, so I'm not really compressing the powder charge in these cases. I am compressing the wool though. So now the whole point of this wool is to make sure that the powder charge stays in a nice tight column all the way down to the head of the case. This ensures that the powder burns in a nice controlled manner. Okay, so we've got wool taking up the air gap in all of those cases. Next step is to separate the wool from the grease cookie by using card wad. It's just a little piece of cardboard that's been waxed. These particular ones came from a box of orange juice, or a carton of orange juice. You can use a milk carton the same way. It's been treated with wax to make it waterproof. It gives you a nice thick piece of cardboard. I'm going to pop that into the neck of the case like that. And then using the same brushing case, I'm just going to push that down the neck to sit on top of the carded wool. And it's got to put one into each of the cases. Okay, so that step went pretty quick. Basically what that card wad does is it separates powder charge from what's called the grease cookie. Now the grease cookie, as the name suggests, is a chunk of grease in the shape of a cookie. This is the grease that I use. A lot of people swear by different formulas. I used a combination of beeswax and vegetable shortening in a ratio of 1:1 to make my grease cookie. And the purpose of the grease cookie is to basically keep the black powder fouling soft inside of the barrel. So as your bullet travels down the barrel, the grease cookie is going to be right behind it, and it's going to combine with all the carbon fouling from the powder, and it's going to keep that fouling soft between shots. One thing that does happen with black powder is that the carbon fouling on the inside of the barrel accumulates pretty quick. It's a very dirty burning powder, and if you leave it in there for too long, that carbon hardens, and the more shots you put through the barrel, the thicker that layer of carbon is going to be. Eventually it's going to get to the point where that carbon becomes a barrel obstruction, and you're going to have a catastrophic failure with your rifle. So we use grease cookies to make sure that that fouling stays soft, and that every subsequent shot will pull a little bit of that carbon fouling out. Another way to minimize the accumulation of carbon buildup in a black powder cartridge rifle is what's called blow tubing. You take just a tube, you insert it into the chamber end of the barrel, and you blow through it. And the moisture from your lungs will then combine with the carbon fouling from the black powder, and will help keep it soft as well. So I use both the grease cookie and the blow tubing between shots just to make sure that carbon fouling stays nice and soft. And you see I've already done a few from the previous batch. The way that we get the grease cookie inside of the case, now that the powder charge is effectively sealed off, we can turn the case upside down without having the powder come out. Let's push the case down into the grease, give it a little twist, and extract ourselves a grease cookie. Set that aside and then top it off with another card wad, and then do it again. Okay, so we've got our cases primed, charged, filled, wadded, and grease cookied. Next step is finally putting the bullets in. So we're coming back to the press. This time we're going to use our bullet seating die. This doesn't necessarily need to touch the case holder. I've already set it up previously to make sure that we're seating bullets to the appropriate depth. What we need now is a bunch of bullets of the appropriate size. And these ones I've cast myself. The alloy that I use is 20:1. 20 parts lead, 1 part tin, so it's relatively soft. But we get good engagement on the rifling, and this particular batch weighs 474 grains. And all we have to do at this point is put the bullet top of the case mouth and seat it with the press. There it is. Now, seating depth on a Martini-Henry isn't something that we have to be so pedantic about. Martini-Henry isn't a terribly accurate rifle. On a good day, I can get 4-inch groups at 100 yards. Typically, I get about 6. So it's a 4 to 6 minute of angle rifle. At least this one is. And I've been working on load development for it to try and bring that down. But 4 to 6 inches at 100 yards, that's about a minute of MP, which is pretty much what the Martini-Henry was intended for. So it's accurate enough. Just a quick note, there is an additional step that one can take when hand loading like this, and that is crimping the neck of the case around the bullet. For a single shot rifle like a Martini-Henry, that isn't necessary, because there's only one round in the rifle at a time. And the whole point of crimping is to avoid bullet setback, or to avoid the bullet coming out of the case under recoil. Now for large caliber rifles that shoot heavy bullets, let's say like a 45-70, that is an issue. Bullets have been known to walk out of the cases, and depending on the rifle that you have, that may affect accuracy. So in a magazine-fed rifle, you would want to crimp after you load your bullets in. But for a single shot, it's not necessary. Just seat your bullets and you're done. Okay, we're pretty much done. The only thing I'm doing now is just wiping these off to remove excess bullet lubrication, although excess is a strong word when it comes to a Martini-Henry. So this whole process is a bit painstaking, It does take a while. You don't have to necessarily anneal your cases every single time you use them. I do the annealing process every second or third loading. But in annealing your brass, just make sure that it lasts longer. And since these cases cost $60 for 20, I'm going to make sure that they last as long as they possibly can. But that's how you anneal brass cases and reload for a Martini-Henry. Don't do what I did because I don't necessarily know what I'm doing. But that has worked for me in the past. Might not work for you. Do your research, do it right, and you'll be good. That's pretty much all I've got for you for today. I can't exactly go out to the range because of circumstances. Things in the world are a little screwy right now. So this is the only gun stuff that I can do.